His name was Louis Armstrong, though he would not always spell it the same way, and the world would not always say it the same way, and he was born on the 4th of August in 1901, or maybe 1900, depending on which document you trusted, and whether anyone had bothered to write it down at all. His mother was Mary Albert, called Mayen, who was 15 or 16 when he was born and worked in the houses of white families, and in other houses too, houses where women went to work at night and came home when the sun was already climbing. His father was Louis Armstrong, who left before the boy could remember him as anything other than an absence, a shape that should have been there, but wasn't. They lived in a part of New Orleans called Bacco Town, in the neighborhood that would later be called Storyville or the Battlefield, streets where the wooden houses leaned against each other like drunks and the privies overflowed, and the women called to men from doorways and windows, where violence was common enough that it didn't always make the newspapers and poverty was the kind that doesn't announce itself, because everyone knew lived the same way. He was raised not quite by his mother, who was there and not there, but by his grandmother Josephine, who took him in when Mayen could not, and then by his mother again, and then by his grandmother, back and forth in a way that was not unusual for children in that time and that place, where the work of raising a child was shared among whoever could manage it on a given week. He learned early that home was not a fixed thing, that love could be real and still not be enough to keep a roof over you, that you made do, that you figured it out, that no one was coming to save you, so you had better save yourself. He sold newspapers on the corner. He sang in a quartet with other boys for pennies thrown from tourists. He hauled coal. He worked on a junk wagon for a family of Lithuanian Jews named Karnofsky, who fed him and let him sing while he worked, and later, much later, he would say they had been kind to him when kindness was not guaranteed, and he wore a Star of David around his neck for the rest of his life, though he was not Jewish and never said he was, just that he remembered. If you found your way here, and you'd like to stay, there's a subscribe button just below, and a like if this is already the kind of night you were hoping for. We'll be here a while. Now, back to Tupelo. The sound of the city was in him before he had words for it. The brass bands that played on the street corners, the parade music, the music that poured out of the dance halls and the honky-tonks, the music called ragtime and the music that was older than ragtime, music that had come up from the plantations and the docks and the churches, music that was African and European and Caribbean all at once, music that had no name yet but would soon be called jazz, though no one was quite sure where the word came from or what it meant. The instruments were cornets and trombones and clarinets, and they played together in a way that was both disciplined and wild, the melody held by the cornet while the clarinet wove around it and the trombone slid beneath, and beneath it all, the drums and the bass, and the whole thing moved forward with a feeling that was like walking and like dancing and like something else entirely, a kind of propulsion, a feeling that once the music started it could not stop, it had to keep going, had to keep moving, or something terrible would happen, though one could say what. Louis heard it all. He heard the bands that played for the white audiences in the better parts of town, and the bands that played in the dance halls where black people went to dance after work, and he heard the blues singers who sang on the corners and in the bars, voices rough and deep and full of something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but some third thing that held both. He heard King Bolden, or heard about him, the cornetist, who they said could blow so loud you could hear him across the river, who played with such power that people stopped in the street, and who ended up in an asylum, his mind gone, before Louis was old enough to really remember him. He heard Freddie Keppard and Bunk Johnson and Joe Oliver, who they called King Oliver, the cornetist who played with a dozen different mutes and made his horn sound like a human voice, like crying, like laughing, like talking in a language that had no words but everyone understood. On New Year's Eve in 1912, or maybe 1913, Louis, who was 11 or 12 years old, took his stepfather's pistol out into the street to celebrate the way people did in that neighborhood, firing into the air at midnight, and he was arrested for it and sent to the colored waif's home for boys. an institution on the outskirts of the city where boys who had nowhere else to go or who had done some minor wrong were sent to be reformed or at least kept off the streets. It was the kind of place that could have been brutal and in some ways was, but it was also the place where Louis Armstrong learned to play the cornet, and so it became in the story of his life the place where everything began, the hinge on which the rest turned. The man who taught him was named Peter Davis, the bandmaster at the waif's home, and he saw something in Louis, some hunger or some aptitude or some quality that could not quite be named. He gave Louis a tambourine first, then a drum, then an alto horn, and finally a cornet, an old battered instrument that had been played by other boys before and would be played by other boys after, but which in Louis's hands became something else. Davis taught him to read music, or started to, though Louis would never be a fluent reader and would always prefer to learn by ear, by listening, by playing a thing over and over until it was inside him. He taught him how to hold the horn, how to breathe, how to make a clean tone, how to play in time with the other boys in the band. The waif's home band played in parades, marching through the streets of New Orleans in their uniforms, and Louis played the lead cornet, and people stopped to listen, and he felt for the first time what it was to be heard, what it was to make a sound that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention, and it was a feeling he would spend the rest of his life chasing. He stayed at the waif's home for a year or maybe two, and when he left he went back to his mother and to the streets and to the work of staying alive. But now he had the cornet, or had access to a cornet, and he played whenever he could, at parties, at dances, in the street. He listened to the older players and tried to copy what they did, the way they phrased, the way they bent notes, the way they made the horn sing. He followed the parades and stood as close as he could to the bandstand and watched the cornetists' fingers, trying to learn their tricks. He played for tips and for drinks and for the chance to sit in with the better bands, and slowly, he got better. His tone got stronger, his fingers got faster, his sense of time got surer. He worked during the day, hauling coal, selling papers, doing whatever work he could find, and at night he played. And at some point in those years he caught the attention of Joe Oliver, King Oliver, who was by then the most respected cornetist in New Orleans, and Oliver took him on, not quite as a student, but as a protégé, someone to watch over, someone to encourage. Oliver let Louis carry his horn, let him sit in on rehearsals, gave him pointers, and sometimes when Oliver had two gigs on the same night, he would send Louis to play one of them, and Louis would arrive with his borrowed cornet and his growing confidence, and he would play, and people would listen, and slowly the word got around that there was this kid, this young cat named Louis, who could really play. By the time Louis was in his late teens, he was playing regularly in the honky-tonks and dance halls of New Orleans, and he was good enough that people wanted to hear him, not just as a novelty, but as a musician. He played in a band on the riverboats that traveled up and down the Mississippi, playing for white audiences who danced and drank and didn't pay much attention, but who kept the band employed. And on those boats he learned to read music better, learned to play in different styles, learned to please a crowd. He married a woman named Daisy Parker, a marriage that did not last and that he would later remember as a mistake, the kind of early entanglement that happens when you are young and do not yet understand what you need or what you are capable of. In 1918, King Oliver left New Orleans for Chicago, and Louis took over his spot in Kid Ory's band, which was an honor and a responsibility to step into the shoes of the man who had mentored him, to be the lead cornet in one of the best bands in the city. He played with Ory for a few years, and he was by then not just good, but exceptional. A player who could do things that other players couldn't, whose tone was bigger and clearer and more expressive, who could play faster and higher and with more feeling. But New Orleans was a small city, and Chicago was a big city, and Chicago was where the music was moving, where the money was, where the future was being made. In the summer of 1922, Joe Oliver sent for him. Oliver was in Chicago leading the Creole Jazz Band at the Lincoln Gardens, a dance hall on the South Side where black Chicagoans went to hear the best music and dance until the early morning, and he needed a second cornet player, someone who could play the harmony parts and take some of the solos and not be threatened by playing next to the king. Louis got on the train not knowing quite what he was heading toward, carrying his cornet in a paper bag, wearing clothes that must have looked country when he arrived. And when he stepped off the train in Chicago, he stepped into a world that was louder and faster and brighter than anything he had known. A city of stockyards and steel mills and tenements packed with black families who had come up from the South, looking for work and freedom and something better. And into this world, Louis brought his horn and his New Orleans sense of swing, and the city would never be quite the same. The Creole Jazz Band was already famous, or as famous as a black jazz band could be in 1922, known for Oliver's cornet and for the way the band played together, tight and hot and swinging. When Louis joined, Oliver and he played a dual cornet lead, the two horns locked together in harmony, and the sound was unlike anything people had heard before. Two cornets playing as one, and then breaking apart, Oliver leading and Louis answering, or Louis leading and Oliver answering, the two of them trading phrases and ideas, and the audience at the Lincoln Gardens would crowd the bandstand and watch them play, astonished. Louis played second cornet, which meant he played beneath Oliver, supporting him, filling in the harmony, taking the occasional solo when Oliver allowed it. And he did this with grace and with humility, because Oliver was his mentor and his idol, and the man who had given him this chance, and also because he understood that his time would come, that he did not need to rush, that if he was patient and kept playing the way he was playing, the world would eventually notice. And the world did notice, or at least the part of the world that paid attention to jazz. Musicians came to hear the Creole Jazz Band and left talking about the second cornet player. The kid from New Orleans with the huge sound and the quicksilver runs, the one who could play higher and faster than anyone else but who never showed off, who played what the music needed. Among the musicians who came to listen was a young pianist named Lil Hardin, who played in the band and who would become Louis's second wife, and who would be one of the first people to tell Louis that he was better than Oliver, that he didn't need to stay in anyone's shadow, that he could be the star. He recorded for the first time with the Creole Jazz Band in 1923, and the recordings, made on primitive equipment in a makeshift studio, captured something of what the band sounded like, though they could not capture the feeling of being in the room, the heat and the sweat, and the dancers and the noise. The recordings were stiff by the standards Louis would later set, the band playing together in an ensemble style where no one soloed for long, where the emphasis was on the group sound, on the collective improvisation that was the hallmark of New Orleans jazz. Louis's cornet is in there, beneath Oliver's, supporting him, occasionally stepping forward for a break or a fill, and if you listen closely you can hear it, the clarity of his tone, the precision of his time, the way he played right in the center of the beat, not ahead of it and not behind it, but right on it, giving the music a forward momentum that was like a train, like a heartbeat, like something you could not resist. Lil Hardin married Louis in 1924, and she pushed him, told him he needed to leave Oliver and go out on his own, that he was too good to be a sideman forever. Louis resisted at first, loyal to Oliver, unsure of his own ability to lead, but Lil was ambitious in a way that Louis was not, or not yet, and she convinced him. In 1924 he left Chicago for New York to join Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, one of the premier black dance bands in the country, playing at the Roseland Ballroom for white audiences who came to dance to the latest hits, and Louis was hired to play third trumpet, to read the arrangements, to blend in with the section. But Louis did not blend in. His sound was too big, his style too different. He had come up playing New Orleans jazz, which was loose and collective and based on improvisation, and Henderson's orchestra played written arrangements, dance music that was supposed to be smooth and polished and sophisticated, and Louis played with a roughness, a rawness, a sense of swing that was at odds with the Henderson style. He played behind the beat, or what sounded like behind the beat, though really he was just phrasing differently, stretching and compressing time in a way that made the music swing harder. The other musicians in the band didn't know what to make of him at first. His clothes were out of style, his manners were too country, his sound was too big and too brash, and some of them made fun of him, called him a hick. But when he stood up to take a solo, they stopped laughing. His solos with the Henderson Band were short, 8 or 16 bars, but they were unlike anything else on the recordings, little explosions of melody and rhythm that seemed to come from a different world than the arranged music around them. He played hot with a kind of intensity and invention that made the rest of the band sound stiff by comparison. And slowly the musicians in the Henderson Band began to understand that they were playing with someone who was operating on a different level, who had an intuitive sense of the music that could not be taught. Coleman Hawkins, the tenor saxophonist in the band, would later say that Louis taught them all how to swing, that before Louis they had been playing dance music, but after Louis they were playing jazz. Louis stayed with Henderson for a little over a year, long enough to make an impression, long enough to be heard by musicians all over New York, and then he went back to Chicago, back to Lil, who had set up opportunities for him to lead his own band and make his own recordings. In November of 1925, he went into a studio in Chicago with a group of musicians that included Lil on piano, Kid Ory on trombone, Johnny Dodds on clarinet, and Johnny St. Cyr on banjo, and they recorded a session under the name Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. And those recordings, and the recordings that followed over the next 3 years, would change the course of jazz. The Hot Five was not a working band. They never played in public, only in the studio, and they recorded a repertoire of popular songs, blues, and original numbers that were sometimes written or co-written by Louis, though the composing credits were often murky. The recordings were made quickly, with minimal rehearsal, the musicians running through the tunes a few times and then committing them to wax. The technology was still primitive, the sound was thin and scratchy, the engineers were learning as they went, but none of that mattered because what came out of Louis's horn on those recordings was so far ahead of anything that had been done before that it rendered all the technical limitations irrelevant. On the early Hot Five recordings, Louis still played in something like the New Orleans style, the band playing together in a collective improvisation with Louis taking breaks and short solos. But as the sessions progressed over the next few years, the format changed, the arrangements became looser, and Louis' solos became longer and more central, until the recordings were essentially showcases for his trumpet and his voice, the other musicians there to support him, to set him up, to get out of his way. He began to play trumpet instead of cornet around this time, the trumpet having a brighter, more cutting sound, and he began to sing more, not just playing the melody but vocalizing it, scatting, using his voice as another instrument, and his voice was like his trumpet, rough and warm and expressive, capable of bending and shaping a melody in ways that made it new. Cornet Chop Suey, recorded in February of 1926, is one of the early examples of what Louis was doing. It opens with a stop-time introduction, the band playing a rhythmic figure and then stopping, leaving Louis to fill the silence with rapid-fire solo breaks, little cascades of notes that land exactly on the beat, and then the band comes back in and Louis plays the melody and then he solos, and the solo is astonishing. A minute and a half of pure invention, phrases that are melodic and rhythmic at the same time, ideas that build on each other, that have a logic and a shape, that swing so hard that the rest of the band sounds almost stiff by comparison. He plays high notes that ring out clear and strong. He plays fast runs that seem effortless. He plays with a kind of confidence and authority that announces this is not just a good musician but a master, someone who has complete command of his instrument and of the music, someone who is not following the rules but making them up as he goes. Potato Head Blues, recorded in May of 1927, has a solo in the final chorus that is a masterpiece of construction. The band drops out except for the rhythm section, and Louis plays a series of stop-time breaks, 2 bars on, 2 bars off, and in those 2-bar breaks he plays phrases that are clear and bold and perfectly placed, each one different from the last, each one propelling the music forward, and the whole thing has a feeling of inevitability. as if these were the only notes that could have been played in this moment, as if Louis is not inventing them, but discovering them, uncovering something that was already there in the music waiting to be revealed. He plays with a kind of relaxation, a looseness, that makes it sound easy, but the precision of his time and the logic of his ideas reveal the discipline beneath the ease. And then there is West End Blues, recorded in June of 1928, which begins with a cadenza, Louis playing alone for the first 12 seconds, no rhythm section, no other instruments, just his trumpet and the sound of his breath and the notes he chooses to play, and those 12 seconds contain the entire history of what jazz would become. A statement of such power and originality that every trumpet player who heard it understood that the game had changed, that this was the new standard, that if you wanted to play jazz trumpet, you had to reckon with what Louis had done. The cadenza is not fast for the sake of being fast. It is a melodic statement, a series of phrases that rise and fall and twist and turn, that start in the low register and climb to the upper register and then tumble back down, and the whole thing is played with absolute clarity and control. Every note perfectly articulated, perfectly placed, and when the band finally comes in behind him, it is almost a relief. The listener has been holding their breath, waiting to see where Louis was going to land, and when he lands and the band is there and the music settles into a groove, the listener has been breathed again. The rest of West End Blues is nearly as remarkable as the opening. Louis plays the melody in the morna to the tramble, Beathing Rebel, Hor Aberstreet of Bapret, Atsinging Wreath a Maid of her, know. The Reniberator and the pianist, the Nully Re comes back in for the final chorus and the pianist, and then Louis comes back in for the final chorus and he plays a single long high note, a B flat that he holds for 4 full bars, a note that should not be possible to hold that long, that should run out of air or lose its center or crack, but Louis holds it steady and strong, and then he finally releases it and plays it 10 phrase, and the listener is left with ticket of spasibility, up Steven, and then he finally released it at Membate of Bethelet. What Louis was doing in these recordings was inventing the jazz solo as it would be understood for the next 50 years. Before Louis, jazz was primarily an ensemble music. Musicians improvised, but they improvised together, the cornet and the clarinet and the trombone weaving around each other, the individual voices subordinated to the group sound. Louis made the solo the center of the music. He showed that a single improviser playing alone or against a rhythm section could create a coherent narrative, could build tension and release it, could take a listener on a journey that had shape and meaning and emotional weight. He showed that a jazz solo was not just a display of technical facility, but a form of storytelling, a way of speaking without words, a language that could express things that words could not. He did this through a combination of technical mastery and emotional expressiveness that no one had brought together before. He had the technique to play anything he could imagine. He could play faster than anyone, higher than anyone, with a bigger sound than anyone, with a bigger sound than anyone, but he used that technique in service of melody and rhythm and feeling, not for its own sake. His solos were melodic. They sang. They had phrases that you could remember and hum. They were not just strings of notes, but tunes in themselves. His solos swung. They had a rhythmic propulsion that was irresistible, that made you want to move, that locked in with the rhythm section and drove the music forward. And his solos were expressive. They had a warmth and a humanity that came through even on the primitive recordings, a sense that there was a person behind the horn, someone who was telling you something, someone who wanted you to feel what he was feeling. He was also singing more, and his singing was as revolutionary as his trumpet playing. Before Louis, popular singers sang the melody as it was written, or close to it with a kind of formal precision, the words enunciated clearly, the phrasing following the natural rhythm of the language. Louis sang the way he played trumpet, bending and stretching the melody, phrasing behind the beat, swallowing syllables and drawing out others, making the song swing, making it personal, making it his. He used scat singing, wordless vocalization, turning his voice into an instrument, and the phrases he sang were the same kind of phrases he played on the trumpet, melodic and rhythmic and full of invention. His voice was rough, gravelly, not pretty in the conventional sense, but it was warm and expressive and utterly distinctive, and it would become one of the most recognizable voices in American music, influencing every popular singer who came after him, from Bing Crosby to Frank Sinatra to Billie Holiday to Ella Fitzgerald and beyond. The Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings were not bestsellers when they were released. They were race records, sold primarily to black audiences, recorded cheaply and distributed through specialized channels. But musicians heard them and were transfixed. Young trumpet players all over the country listened to those records over and over, wearing out the shellac, trying to copy Louis' solos note for note, trying to understand how he did what he did. It was not just the notes, but the feeling, the sense of absolute mastery combined with absolute freedom, and it was not something that could be easily imitated, because it came from somewhere deep inside Louis, from his life and his history and his way of being in the world. By the late 1920s, Louis was becoming famous, not just among musicians but among the broader public. He moved to New York again in 1929 and began playing in larger venues, leading big bands, appearing in shows, making more recordings. He began to be featured in theatrical revues, standing at the front of the stage with his trumpet, grinning, wiping his face with a white handkerchief, playing for audiences who were not just there to dance, but to see him, to hear him, to witness his charisma and his talent. He developed a stage persona, the wide smile, the rolling eyes, the comedic mugging that some people found endearing and others found troubling, a minstrel echo, a playing to white expectations of black entertainers, but Louis understood that to be successful as a black performer in white America, you had to give the audience something they were comfortable with, something that did not threaten them, and if that meant smiling and joking and acting the part of the genial entertainer, then that was the price you paid. But underneath the smile was a man who was serious about his music, who worked harder than almost anyone, who played every night and practiced during the day and thought constantly about his sound, his phrasing, his embouchure. He was obsessed with the physical mechanics of playing the trumpet, with breath control and lip strength, and he developed a method that allowed him to play the high notes that other trumpet players could barely reach, and to play them night after night without wearing out. He used a lip salve that he swore by. He practiced long tones, holding single notes for as long as he could, building his endurance. He thought about the trumpet not as a separate thing, but as an extension of his body, his breath, his voice. In the 1930s, Louis became a star, one of the most famous black entertainers in America, touring constantly, playing theaters and ballrooms and concert halls, leading big bands that played both jazz and popular music, recording prolifically. The recordings from this period are less revolutionary than the Hot 5 sides. They are more commercial, more oriented toward the mainstream, arrangements of popular songs with Louis playing a chorus and singing a chorus, and the band filling in the rest. But even in these more commercial settings, Louis' presence was unmistakable, his trumpet solos leaping out of the arrangements, his voice transforming even the most mundane material into something personal and warm and swinging. He traveled to Europe in 1932 and was received as a conquering hero, the audiences in London and Paris and Copenhagen treating him not as a race records artist, but as a serious musician, an artist, someone whose work deserved respect. In Europe, he was not subjected to the same racial indignities he faced in America. He could stay in the best hotels, eat in the best restaurants, walk down the street without fear, and he loved Europe for that, for the feeling of being treated as a human being, and he would return many times over the years. But America was home, and he always came back to the circuits and the one-nighters and the Jim Crow South, where he played for black audiences in segregated venues, and stayed in black hotels, and ate in black restaurants, and understood that no matter how famous he became, no matter how much the white audiences applauded, he was still a black man in America, with all that entailed. In 1935, he hired a manager named Joe Glazer, and Glazer would manage Louis for the rest of his life, more than 30 years, and the relationship was one of the central relationships of Louis's life, complicated and in some ways troubling and in some ways essential. Glazer was a white man, a tough, hard-nosed businessman who had connections to the mob and who used those connections to book Louis into venues that might not have been available otherwise, to protect him from trouble, to negotiate fees that were higher than most black entertainers could command. Glazer took care of the business side so that Louis could focus on the music, and Louis trusted him, relied on him, defended him against critics who said Glazer was taking too much money, working Louis too hard, preventing him from taking artistic risks. And there was truth to those criticisms. Under Glazer's management, Louis played an exhausting schedule, more than 300 nights a year at the peak. One-nighters all over the country, never stopping, never resting, the touring so relentless that it damaged Louis's health, particularly his lips, which became scarred and calloused from the constant playing, the constant pressure of the mouthpiece against his embouchure. Glazer was focused on keeping Louis working, keeping him in the public eye, making money, and that meant saying yes to everything, playing every gig, recording every song, appearing in every film, and while it made Louis rich and famous, it also meant that he had less control over his artistic direction, less time to develop new material, less space to simply rest and be. But Louis did not seem to resent it, or if he did, he never said so publicly. He loved to play, loved to be on stage, loved the feeling of connecting with an audience, and if that meant playing the same songs over and over, hitting the same high notes, wiping his face with the same white handkerchief, making the same jokes, then so be it. He had come from nothing, from streets where children did not expect to live to adulthood, from a world where a black man's life was cheap and disposable. And now he was famous, he was rich, he was respected, he could take care of his family and his friends, and that was not nothing, that was everything. He appeared in films, starting in the 1930s and continuing through the 60s, usually playing himself or a version of himself, the band leader, the entertainer, the grinning musician. Some of the films were forgettable, B-movies and musicals that have not aged well. But in others, Louis's presence transcends the material. His performance a reminder of what charisma looks like, what genuine star power looks like, what genuine star power looks like. In Pennies from Heaven in 1936, he sings and plays, and his performance is the best thing in the film. In Cabin in the Sky in 1943, he plays the trumpet in a sequence that is both joyous and surreal, and his face on screen is alive, alert, present in a way that few performers ever manage. But the roles he was offered were limited by the racism of the Hollywood studio system, and he played servants and band leaders and musicians, but never heroes, never leading men, never characters with interiority or agency. The roles were often demeaning, and some black critics and intellectuals criticized Louis for taking them, for perpetuating stereotypes, for not using his fame to demand better treatment. Louis's response was pragmatic. He took the work that was available. He made the best of it. He got paid. And if people didn't like it, they didn't have to watch. He understood the game, understood that Hollywood was not going to change for him, and he made the calculation that it was better to be in the films, to be seen, to be heard, than to be excluded entirely on principle. This is the kind of moment we made this channel for, this tension between the man and the myth, between the voice that could still break you open and the trap that fame had built around him. If you're still with us, and we hope you are, a like or a subscribe goes a long way. Now let's keep going. The 1940s were years of transition in jazz. The big band era was fading. The swing music that had dominated the 30s was giving way to bebop, a new style of jazz that was faster, more complex, more aggressive, played by a younger generation of musicians who had grown up listening to Louis, but who were now trying to move beyond him, to find their own voice. Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk were playing music that was harmonically adventurous, rhythmically intricate, focused on the virtuosity of the individual soloist, and it was in many ways an extension of what Louis had started with the Hot Five, the emphasis on the solo, on individual expression, but it was also a rejection of the entertainment aspect of jazz, a refusal to smile and play for the white audience, a declaration that jazz was art, not entertainment, and that black musicians did not owe white people any not. Louis did not play bebop. He was in his 40s by then, established, successful, and his style was from an earlier era, the swing era, the New Orleans tradition, and he saw no reason to change. He continued to play the way he had always played, with a big sound and a strong sense of melody and a commitment to entertaining the audience, and the younger bebop musicians sometimes dismissed him as old-fashioned, as a relic, as someone who had been revolutionary once but who had settled into a comfortable middle age and was now just going through the motions. There was some truth to that, but there was also some resentment, that generational tension that always exists between those who open the door and those who walk through it. In 1947, Louis broke up his big band and formed a small group called the All-Stars, a sextet that played in a style that was closer to the New Orleans jazz of his youth, looser and more improvisation-based than the big band arrangements. The All-Stars included some of the best musicians in jazz: Jack Teagarden on trombone, Barney Bigard on clarinet, Earl Hines on piano, and they toured constantly, playing festivals and concert halls and nightclubs, and the music they played was joyous and swinging and accessible, not pushing the boundaries the way bebop was, but not trying to, just playing good solid jazz with Louis at the center, his trumpet and his voice still commanding, still capable of moments of transcendence. The All-Stars format allowed Louis to stretch out more, to take longer solos, to interact with the other musicians in a way that the big band format had not allowed, and some of the recordings from this period capture Louis at his most relaxed and playful, trading phrases with Teagarden, riffing with Hines, his trumpet sound a little rougher than it had been in the 20s, but still unmistakable, still his. He recorded Blueberry Hill in 1949, and it became a hit, his voice rough and warm, the song stripped down to its essence, and it was a reminder that Louis could take almost any song, no matter how simple or sentimental, and make it his own, make it swing, make it something worth listening to. But by the 1950s, the contradictions of Louis's position were becoming harder to ignore. He was the most famous black musician in America, perhaps the most famous black man in America after Joe Louis, and he was beloved by white audiences who saw him as non-threatening, as a symbol of racial harmony, as proof that if black people just worked hard and smiled and entertained, they could be successful. At the same time, younger black Americans, particularly the generation that was coming of age in the civil rights movement, looked at Louis and saw something else. They saw the smile and the handkerchief and the mugging, and they saw accommodation. They saw someone who was playing a role to please white people, someone who was not standing up, not fighting back, not using his platform to demand change. The criticism was most famously articulated by Miles Davis, who in a 1958 interview called Louis an Uncle Tom, said he was playing that plantation humor, said he was a sellout. The comment was cruel and reductive, and it hurt Louis, who respected Miles, who had always supported younger musicians, who had never tried to hold anyone back or claim that his way was the only way. Louis defended himself, said that he played the way he played because that was who he was, that he smiled because he liked to smile, that he had grown up in a different time, had survived in a different way, and that did not make him a sellout, it made him a survivor. And then in 1957, during the crisis in Little Rock, when the governor of Arkansas was blocking the integration of Central High School and President Eisenhower was hesitating to intervene, Louis gave an interview to a reporter and he spoke with a bluntness that shocked his publicists and his manager and much of the country. He called Eisenhower two-faced and said he had no guts. He said the government was allowing black children to be terrorized and that he was ashamed of his country. He canceled a State Department-sponsored tour of the Soviet Union, saying he could not represent a country that treated its black citizens the way America did. The comments made national news, and they revealed a Louis that the public had not seen before, a Louis who was angry, who was political, who was willing to risk his career and his reputation to speak out. The moment passed. Eisenhower eventually sent federal troops to Little Rock, and Louis went back to playing and smiling and entertaining, and the white audiences who loved him seemed to forget that he had ever said anything controversial. But the black audiences, the younger black Americans who had dismissed him as an Uncle Tom, they did not forget, and some of them saw him differently after that, saw that underneath the smile there was a man who understood what was happening, who felt the indignities and the injustices, who had simply chosen a different way of navigating them. Louis kept playing, kept touring, kept recording into the 1960s, and his health began to fail. His lips were damaged from decades of playing, scarred and calloused and sometimes bleeding, and he played through the pain because he did not know how to do anything else. He had a heart attack in 1959 and was told to rest, to slow down, but he was back on the road within weeks. He had another heart attack in 1968 and spent 2 months in the hospital, and when he came out he went back on the road again, not because Glazer was forcing him, though Glazer certainly encouraged him, but because playing was what Louis did. It was his identity, his purpose, and to stop playing was to stop being Louis Armstrong. In 1964 he recorded Hello, Dolly, a song from the Broadway musical, and it became an enormous hit, the biggest hit of Louis's career, topping the charts and knocking the Beatles out of the #1 spot. And Louis, who was 63 years old and had been playing professionally for more than 40 years, was suddenly back on top, back in the mainstream, a pop star again. The recording was sweet and nostalgic and utterly charming, Louis's voice gravelly and warm, and it introduced him to a new generation of listeners who had never heard the Hot Five, who had never seen him in his prime, who knew him only as this kindly old man with the raspy voice and the big smile. And that was fine. That was what the moment called for. Tid a broacher chick of regard be tabadak. To the faturaki feature by ideas, for a created if water to spady mudget subbaket coat stirred fee with it foot to the sofa shell. The midu bar repudiant, the wilchikan deba to kudikim thereat. For chkadaman threp and tar the film. Fine since much wish the brow. The twit out that eads, biddy palmet wicken saint. But couldn't a witted friend, with it spent, with all the derried. Then Mardik, the Bajwat Shoal, the Ferrogan, Bijad Bebe, Thay Kabigak, the Bai, the Pueled, Bijad Bigant, the Bidi one, the Photobite, the Bitgil Shroud, Bijout the Bill, the Biquained. The 1960s were hard years for Louis in other ways. The civil rights movement was at its peak, and the anger and the militancy that characterized it were at odds with Louis' public persona. Younger black activists saw him as a relic, as someone who represented the old way of accommodating white power, and they were impatient with him, dismissive of him, and Louis felt that dismissal, felt the generational gap widening. He supported the movement in his own way, quietly, giving money to civil rights organizations, speaking out when he felt it was necessary, but he did not march, did not protest, did not use his fame in the way that some people thought he should, and so he remained a complicated figure, loved by some and criticized by others, and he lived with that complication because he had always lived with it, because it was the condition of being a black artist in America, particularly a black artist of his generation. He kept playing, kept touring, and his body kept failing. His lips were in such bad shape that he could no longer play the high notes he had once played with ease, and sometimes he could barely play at all, and he started to feature his singing more, his trumpet less, because his voice, though rough, was still there, still capable of delivering a song with warmth and feeling. He played his last gig in March of 1971, just a few months before his 70th birthday, and then he went home to his house in Corona, Queens, the house he had lived in since 1943, a modest house in a working-class neighborhood where he had always felt comfortable, where he knew the neighbors and they knew him, and he was not Louis Armstrong, the star, but Louis Armstrong, the man who lived on the corner. He died on July 6, 1971, of a heart attack at home in his sleep, and the news was reported around the world, and the tributes poured in, from musicians and from presidents and from ordinary people who had heard his music and been moved by it. He was buried in Flushing Cemetery in Queens, and the funeral was attended by thousands, and the music played at the funeral was jazz, of course, because Louis had spent his entire life making jazz, had invented much of what jazz was, and to honor him without music would have been impossible. What Louis Armstrong left behind was not just a body of recordings, though the recordings are astonishing, a trail of evidence that documents his evolution from a New Orleans cornet player to the most influential improviser in jazz history. What he left behind was a way of playing, a way of singing, a way of being on stage and in the world, that shaped everything that came after him. Every jazz musician who improvises a solo is working in the tradition that Louis established. Every singer who bends a melody or phrases behind the beat or uses their voice as an instrument is drawing on what Louis did. Every entertainer who understands that connecting with an audience is as important as technical mastery is, following a path that Louis walked. But the legacy is complicated by the contradictions of the life. Was Louis an accommodationist, a man who smiled and played the clown to please white audiences, or was he a strategist, a man who understood the system and used it to achieve a level of success and security that would have been impossible otherwise? Was he a sellout or a survivor? The answer is probably both, or neither, or it depends on who is asking and when and what they need Louis to be. Louis himself seemed unbothered by the question, or at least he did not spend much time answering it. And his own writings, the letters and the autobiographies he wrote but never published, the reel-to-reel tapes he made where he talked about his life, and his career-reel tapes he made where he talked about his life and his career reveal a man who was clear-eyed about the world he lived in, who understood the game and played it as well as he could, who loved the music more than anything and who saw his role as bringing that music to as many people as possible, by any means necessary. There is a photograph of Louis from the 1950s, taken backstage somewhere, and in the photograph he is sitting alone holding his trumpet and his face is at rest, no smile, no performance, just a man with his instrument, and the face is tired and thoughtful and serious, and it is a reminder that beneath the entertainer was a musician. Beneath the celebrity was an artist. Beneath the smile was a man who had lived through poverty and racism and who had made something extraordinary out of that life, who had taken a battered cornet in a reform school and turned it into a voice that spoke for a generation, for a country, The Hot Five recordings remain the central pillar of his legacy, the work that changed what was possible in jazz, that demonstrated that improvisation could be an art form, that a solo could be a composition, that a musician playing in the moment could create something as coherent and moving and lasting as anything written down on paper. The recordings are crude by modern standards, the sound thin and distant, the surface noise intrusive, but none of that matters because what is underneath the surface noise is pure Louis, his sound, his ideas, his swing, his sense of time, his melodic gift, his ability to take a simple tune and transform it into something complex and beautiful and utterly his own. West End blues in particular has never lost its power. Musicians still study it, still marvel at it, still try to understand how Louis did what he did in that opening cadenza, how he conceived those phrases, how he executed them with such clarity and authority, how he made something so difficult sound so easy, so natural, as if it could not have been any other way. The recording is less than 3 minutes long, and it contains more musical information, more innovation, more beauty than most musicians create in a lifetime, and it stands as a monument not just to Louis's genius, but to the possibilities of jazz, the possibilities of improvisation, the possibilities of what can happen when a musician is so deeply connected to the music, and to the moment that something new comes into being, something that did not exist before, and will never exist again, in quite the same way. Louis's voice, too, is part of the legacy. That gravelly, warm, instantly recognizable voice that could make the saddest song sound hopeful and the silliest song sound sincere. He was not a great singer in the technical sense. His range was limited, his pitch was sometimes shaky, his tone was rough, but he was a great communicator, a great interpreter, a great storyteller, and when he sang a song you believed him, you felt that he meant it, that he was singing to you, not at you, that he wanted you to feel what he was feeling. And that is a rare gift, perhaps rarer than technical perfection. And then there is the question of the smile, the handkerchief, the persona, the performance of joy in the face of everything. Was it real? Was it a mask? Was it both? The answer matters less than the fact that Louis maintained it, that he played hundreds of nights a year for 50 years, and almost always he smiled. Almost always he gave the audience what they came for, and whether that was courage or compromise or simply professionalism, it was a kind of endurance, a refusal to let the world see him break, and there is something in that refusal that resonates, that speaks to the experience of anyone who has had to keep going when everything inside them wanted to stop, who has had to perform in the face of exhaustion or pain or grief, who has had to smile when smiling was the last thing they felt. In his last years, when he was playing less and resting more, Louis spent time at home in Corona, and he was a fixture in the neighborhood, sitting on his stoop, talking to neighbors, signing autographs for kids, just being present in a way that famous people rarely are. He was generous with his time and his money, giving to friends and strangers, helping people who needed help, and he did it quietly, without making a show of it, because that was who he was, someone who remembered where he came from, who remembered what it was like to have nothing, who understood that the difference between him and the people who had nothing was not talent alone, but luck, timing, opportunity, and the help of people who had given him a chance when they didn't have to. He loved to eat, loved rich food and red beans and rice and the cooking of his fourth wife Lucille, who he married in 1942 and who stayed with him for the rest of his life, a stable presence in a life that was otherwise constant motion. He loved to laugh, loved dirty jokes and pranks and stories, and he had a high, cackling laugh that was as distinctive as his trumpet sound. He loved to write, filling notebooks and typing letters and recording tapes, documenting his life because he understood that his life was worth documenting, that he had lived through extraordinary times and had done extraordinary things, and that the story should be told, even if he was the only one who would read it. And he loved to play. That was the constant, the through line, the thing that never changed from the time he picked up a cornet in the Colored Waif's home to the last gig in 1971. He loved the feeling of the horn against his lips, loved the feeling of the air moving through the horn and becoming sound, loved the feeling of playing with other musicians, of locking in with the rhythm section, of trading phrases with a trombonist or a clarinet player, of standing in front of an audience and feeling them respond, feeling the energy come back at him, the loop of communication that is at the heart of all performance. He loved it when it was easy, and he loved it when it was hard, and he loved it even when his lips were bleeding, and his heart was failing, and his body was telling him to stop, because playing was who he was, and to stop playing was unimaginable. The myth of Louis Armstrong is the myth of the self-made man, the boy from the streets who became the king, the entertainer who brought joy to millions, the symbol of American music and American possibility. But the reality is more complicated and more interesting. The reality is a man who was brilliant and flawed, who was a genius on his instrument, and who sometimes made questionable choices, who was generous and kind, and who also played the game, who smiled when he had to and spoke out when he could, who loved his music and his wife and his marijuana and his laxatives and his friends, who lived a life that was public and private at the same time, who was seen by millions but understood by very few, who gave everything he had to his art and to his audience, and who received in return fame and wealth and restempt and respect, all of it, buck of the bargain. The redicutera per yark to betarvicatide di benecaper per yart and traparitaken great operated fritzit mean for two camperidarated subbats. Ever bulbud a moderators say trouble betum type a bakebat. There are what to carburas and dataverate, and whatever butterbration sound like singing, more like singing, more like singing, more like ficken the bake. And yet there is something in it, some tenderness, some warmth, some presence, and when he sings the title line, "We have all the time in the world. There is running out of time. His body what time? Be quatro, be dope, pride. Be kidect, ye will gay doge. Be kided not, have it will wheat, be white bade." Louis Armstrong played his trumpet for nearly 60 years, and in that time he changed the world, or at least he changed the music, and the music changed the world, and the two things are maybe the same thing. He took a language that was being invented around him, and he gave it grammar and syntax and vocabulary. He showed what could be said with it, how far it could go, how high it could reach, and everyone who came after him was working in the house that he built, whether they acknowledged it or not, whether they liked it or not, whether they liked it or not. He was the first, and in some ways he is still the best, the purest expression of what jazz can be when it is played by someone who has complete mastery and complete freedom, who is so inside the music that there is no distance between the player and the sound, between the thought and the note, between the feeling and the expression of the feeling. And he did it all with a smile, or with the appearance of a smile, which is maybe the same thing, or maybe the opposite, and the question of which it was is a question that Louis lived with, and that we are still living with, still arguing about, still trying to understand. Was the smile a gift or a compromise? Was it generosity or survival? Was it who he was or who he had to be? And the answer, like most answers about complicated people, is probably yes, yes to all of it, yes to the contradictions, yes to the impossibility of separating the man from the myth, the artist from the entertainer, the genius from the survivor. There are moments in the recordings where you can hear Louis at his merdi per torn. The pronozem is where the smile falls away, and what is left is just the sound of a man playing his horn, and those moments are almost unbearably beautiful, not because they are technically perfect, but because they are true, because they contain some essence of what it means to be alive, to be human, to take the breath in your body and turn it into sound, into something that moves through the air and into the ears of other people, and changes something in them, even if they don't know why, even if they can't explain it, even if they don't know why, even if they'd cated 5 minutes like. Those moments are what Louis was chasing every time he picked up his horn, and he caught them more often than almost anyone, and they are still there, caught on those old recordings, waiting to be heard again, waiting to be discovered by new listeners who will hear them and think, yes, this is what music can do, this is what a human being can do, this is what is possible. Roddy Hibrachi for the Epicadfreet, Shukikable Bullfetted Shiverty, Bedicus of Divigiver Dapt of 3 Kudabards of Far to Device Shimmertits, of a to of Sempo, what is evermore so for the bird golfed, be the blower away to the wheat side, what is the copy of the Abraquadus Bristle. Ronnie the party washing the thitchu to what we can, the trove them what to the peacock, that once you view us the tube, forces to the old court, that wants you to begets ridic and with gay the brithik. But trailed. But triblet, to the cabrego. But traffic on to breathe the go dom. The first because to be cretu. If one of the abigru to find that for the built. Add with bako badger, but he ever to be heard again. It's like that I'd taub type, but it's robites cop up the kai pile gap, sad sub bob sub. Chimbutai khan, subtin to mood of a tump from card of the back calp, to wet up the back alp of I tot pub of I toppa, card pub but hop top but tie top block tough, jumped up but top but I got up pot, about scope by Joe tabbed up both for a card. To rehe bat them and tad bottoms, and cart, fod putum pop up a cart, fort pipe bot up, jol but tad ball cat mook, go to pot bell, for touch of the bike lot yet. Didak, well, that it's the traits tomato. The right bite, ball dead to keep up that. There I go like. Perjody bridge to but to cock a predicted that chick or a predicate of a brae could have separated to grow quick craw for did a butter cut to do fed for a big be timch faggot. The truth that other bed outfitted bed with pretty girl, sit ready fell to them. The grip avoid breeze, we speak out to spot alternative cage couple, spread as freakage to get rid of bitch. The be trick, but for just separate to which the bibber cheats is for the bet that tracks. Backward projected sorry to which go record bets for. Taff at your backs, coke cat. Very quick grip that. Jack very could be. There is something that stays with you after a long night with Louis Armstrong's music. Not a single song, not a single moment, but a quality of presence, a sense that somewhere in all those recordings, in all those performances, in all those years of playing until the breath gave out and the heart finally followed, A man had found a way to be completely himself in public, and to make that look like the most natural thing in the world. He bent the trumpet to his own purposes, and the trumpet bent back, and what came out of that negotiation was something the world had never quite heard before, and has never stopped hearing since. He didn't invent joy, but he found a way to make it structural, to build it into the architecture of a phrase, to let it carry weight and meaning the way grief carries weight and meaning in other hands. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. We make these episodes because we believe that spending a long, slow hour inside someone else's life is one of the better things you can do with a quiet night, that there is something nourishing about following a story all the way through, about letting the details accumulate, about arriving at the end of a life and feeling, however briefly, that you understand something you didn't before. If tonight gave you that, if Louis' story sat with you the way we hoped it would, a like or a subscribe is the simplest way to say so, and it helps other late-night wanderers find their way here, to this channel, to these slow, long journeys into lives well worth knowing. So wherever you are right now, settled in, lights down, the world outside, doing whatever it does without you, we hope this felt like good company. We hope somewhere in the back of your mind there's still a melody running, something warm and slightly ragged at the edges, the way his tone always was, full and burnished and human all the way through. You came here tonight for a reason, even if you couldn't have named it, and we're glad you stayed. Rest now. The music will still be there in the morning. It always is.